Greece has a habit of refusing to stay in the past, which makes it a complicated place to visit and an even more complicated place to understand. Welcome to The Rise the Limit, and Chapter 1. Past and Polis in Greece, where the landscape itself becomes a kind of argument, one shaped by tectonic shifts, Minoan traders, Mycenaean warlords, and eventually the city-state, the Polis, that peculiar Greek invention where civic life, philosophy, and collective identity were first worked out in public. What makes this chapter worth sitting with is how that thread, from the earliest Aegean settlements through Byzantine Constantinople's fall to Ottoman artillery in 1453, never actually breaks. It just changes hands. The story ahead traces exactly how a civilization keeps reinventing its own continuity, and what that looks like when you're standing in the middle of it. Every mountain and harbour in Greece comes preloaded with a myth, and that turned planning an itinerary into triage. You cannot see everything, so you pick your ruins and carry the guilt. Long before anyone wrote any of it down, the Mediterranean itself dried out and refilled over the course of 5 million years, a geological timeline that assigns high confidence to the theory that our historical neuroses are completely irrelevant. That might plausibly be the most dramatic thing that happens on this trip, or the least, depending on the day. On Crete, I walked the same stones as the Minoans. They built multi-story palaces with working plumbing and paved Europe's oldest road centuries before the classical world had even been imagined. On the mainland, the prose has to shift key. Sing, muse of my dusty and mildly tragic climb toward the Acropolis, where the walls are stacked from limestone blocks so absurdly large that later Greeks decided only Cyclopes could have moved them. Hauling my own considerably less mythic body up that hill felt like its own minor epic. Athens gave the world democracy, more or less. Many leaders were chosen by lottery rather than election, a level of randomness I believe modern politics could plausibly stand to relearn. The Parthenon has been a temple, a church, a mosque, and the site of an accidental gunpowder explosion, and it is still standing. That is more than I can say for my sleep schedule. Not far off is Sparta. That society was built entirely around not losing, which produced the doomed stand of 300 men at Thermopylae. It was a tactical bottleneck that makes airport security feel almost forgivable. None of it stayed put. Alexander, tutored by Aristotle and apparently allergic to sitting still, marched Greek language and art as far as India. Centuries later, as the classical world lost steam, that same culture carried on in the east as Byzantium. Constantinople was its Greek-speaking capital for 1,000 years. That run lasted right until Ottoman cannons ended it in 1453. Even 4 centuries of Ottoman rule could not erase it. The identity kept going quietly in island harbours, mountain villages, and monastery libraries until it resurfaced in the 1821 War of Independence. This was a revolution romantic enough that Lord Byron showed up to die for it. An early and fully committed influencer. I ended the trip eating baklava in city squares, watching a country that has rebuilt itself after every disaster history could throw at it. They survived a refugee crisis in the 1920s, a German invasion in the 1940s, and an economic collapse within my own lifetime. I came looking for ruins. What I found was a country that refuses to stay one. The modern survival of Greece is just the current data point in a timeline of resilience that stretches backward through Hellenistic conquests and classical warfare. To track how that cycle of collapse and reinvention became a permanent cultural feature, one has to return to the first stone palaces of the Bronze Age. From Knossos to Alexander, Greece unspooled. Navigating the remnants of these previously mentioned ruins requires keeping a mental scorecard of the chronology. It is a striking historical irony that ancient kings launched massive armadas and slaughtered entire populations to secure divine glory. only to end up controlling supply chains for what essentially amounted to imported grain bowls and Bronze Age gas station snacks like salted fish and dried figs. The actual narrative of ancient Greece begins on the island of Crete with the Minoans, Europe's first advanced civilization, which flourished from roughly 3000 to 1100 BCE. They were a vibrant, sea-oriented people who built massive palace centers like Knossos, decorated with vivid frescoes of dolphins and acrobats leaping over bulls. Rather than hiding behind heavy military fortifications, the Minoans relied on vast maritime trade networks to protect their wealth. This relatively peaceful arrangement held until the Mycenaeans ascended on the Greek mainland between 1600 and 1100 BCE. The Mycenaeans were the first true Greek-speaking civilization, and they operated very differently from their island neighbors. Functioning as a fierce, palace-based warrior society, the Mycenaeans simply took over the Minoan administration on Crete around 1450 BCE, absorbing the older culture into their own expanding military network. I deploy rigorous historiographical frameworks and analyze complex archaeological data to map the shifting power dynamics of the Mediterranean basin, which is a polite way of admitting I frequently lose track of exactly which bearded seafaring man with a shield was occupying which peninsula at any given time. What is certain is that this Mycenaean era provides the historical backdrop for the legendary Trojan War. Archaeologists have confirmed that a real city of Troy, located in modern Turkey, was violently destroyed by fire and siege around 1180 BCE. This date perfectly matches a chaotic period known as the Late Bronze Age Collapse. A time when the great mainland palaces burned to the ground, long-distance trade dried up, and the early Greek writing system vanished completely. Following this collapse, Greece fell into a centuries-long period of rebuilding routinely called the Dark Age. At the tail end of this era, around 700 BCE, the legendary poet Homer composed the Odyssey. Although the epic tells the story of the clever King Odysseus trying to sail home from the Trojan War, it was actually written roughly 500 years after the real battle took place. To the Greeks of Homer's time, the Bronze Age was a lost, semi-mythical era of giant heroes and temperamental gods. These stories were sung by bards to give the new generation a shared cultural memory, connecting their modest present to a monumental past. The timeline then fast-forwards about 220 years to 480 BCE, when Greece had transformed into a network of independent, fiercely competitive city-states, abruptly forced to unite against the invading army of the Persian king Xerxes. That war produced the single most over-merchandised military defeat in human history. A narrow mountain pass, a small Greek coalition, and roughly 3 centuries' worth of gift shop mugs. A story worth its own full telling later on. Finally, the chronology jumps ahead another 150 years to the 330s BCE, bringing the focus back to Alexander the Great. Born in 356 BCE, Alexander inherited a powerful Macedonian army and set out to conquer the very Persian Empire that had once invaded Greece. Armed with a brilliant military mind and keeping a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow for inspiration, he marched his forces across 3 continents. His sudden death in Babylon in 323 BCE marked the end of the classical era. A skeptic might argue that a single sudden casualty could not possibly overwrite the cultural code of the known world. Yet the historical record demonstrates that when a young commander expires and leaves behind a massive fractured territory, the resulting Hellenistic empire has little choice but to forever blend Greek and Eastern cultures. That inevitable geographic drift toward the east set the coordinates for my own impending departure. though it is considerably easier to romanticize the structural collapse of ancient empires when you are not actively ignoring the likelihood of a catastrophic plumbing failure brewing beneath your own domestic floorboards. Cracks before Istanbul. Preparing to witness the aggressively magnificent ruins of ancient civilizations requires leaving your own home. This process is much easier when your house preemptively decides to become a ruin itself. The sheer logistics of escaping the country had to be tackled day by day. Half of my residence abruptly abandoned its belief in hot water, initiating a severe domestic crisis right before our departure. Given the circumstances, we did the most rational thing possible and abandoned the property entirely. We drafted my in-laws to sit in our living room and supervise the labor of highly trained repairmen who promised a swift resolution. To keep a long story short, the repairs failed completely. It began subtly with an unusually climbing water bill and a suspiciously warm spot on the floor of the house, paired with the sudden, rude awakening of colder showers. I bravely donned my local detective hat. I dove under sinks and forcibly twisted valves to successfully bypass the recirculating system in hopes of outsmarting the plumbing. Unfortunately, the invisible adversary was a phantom hot water leak under the foundational slab, silently bleeding many gallons a day. It was so stealthy that even advanced acoustic detection could not locate it. We called in the professionals from American Leak Detection and Riverside Plumbing. Since the subterranean PEX lines refused to confess their crimes, the architecture had to be interrogated by force. The hardened slab was violently cut open to reveal absolutely no water. It was a grim strategy reminiscent of 1453, when Ottoman cannons shattered the impenetrable walls of Constantinople to reduce 1,000 years of wealthy Roman heritage into pulverized rubble. During this localized destruction, I was desperately Googling, "How can PEX break underground?" looking for answers from a universe that clearly had a grudge against my house. The ultimate plan at this point was to jackhammer the earth. I had 2 insurance claims from 2022 and 2023 already on my record. Calling the insurance agent for a third time felt like playing Russian roulette with my premiums and policy renewal. I boldly elected to ride this subterranean war out of pocket. We arrived at the Atlanta airport obscenely early, driven by a deep distrust of federal security theater. The night before, I carefully inputted our TSA pre-check numbers into the database. The airline computer system exercised its absolute authority to ignore user input. It simply discarded the data. Our boarding passes printed without the necessary clearance icons. This presented a massive problem, because TSA agents were effectively on strike. The standard security queue stretched through the entire terminal for an estimated 3 hours. It was populated by a stationary mob of defeated travelers. We walked directly to the ticket counter and commanded the staff to type the numbers a second time. Upon this second attempt, the digital system mercifully acknowledged our existence. The clear biometric lane was shut down completely despite scheduled operating hours. Fortunately, the regular pre-check line only demanded 15 minutes of our mortal lives. After surviving security, we retreated to the airport lounge for a bit before boarding our flight to Istanbul on Turkish Air. The overnight flight was uneventful. The 787 business seats were adequate and the food and service were fantastic compared to American Airlines, which is a fantastically low bar. We settled in for the journey, surrendering the fate of our domestic rubble to my in-laws as we climbed eastward toward the historic waterways of Turkey. Bosphorus boarding, Turkish Airlines and troubled lines. Crossing an ocean to escape a leaking pipe is, admittedly, an overreaction. Our aircraft ascended into the stratosphere, vaulting us away from domestic infrastructure failures and toward the famous dividing line separating Europe and Asia. 10 hours later, peering through the window like a wandering commander inspecting a newly acquired domain, I looked down at the Dardanelles. That historic strait operated as a heavily contested geopolitical choke point. During the Gallipoli campaign of World War I, massive armies fought over this narrow slip of water in a brutal display of imperial gatekeeping, a conflict that turned these shores into a staging ground for artillery and sorrow, a situation undeniably suboptimal for everyone involved. Classical scholars still call the waterway by its ancient name, the Hellespont, which remains a genuinely magnificent thing to call a body of water. Soon after passing the battlegrounds, we traced the Bosphorus toward the epic sprawl of Istanbul, routing through the new Turkish airport, a glass fortress of modern transit planted firmly on the European side. The authorities famously transferred all equipment and functions from the old Asian side airport to this new complex in exactly 1 day, a logistical triumph of mythic proportions. Relocating an entire aviation hub overnight requires the kind of organizational firepower that makes the architectural achievements of early civilizations look like a casual weekend project. Turkish Airlines offers an incredible number of connections across the globe, and their onboard service is truly excellent. Their customer service division, conversely, is a desolate wasteland. I had learned this firsthand before we even reached the airport, when I tried to call in and add the rejected TSA pre-check numbers to my reservation. The representatives proved utterly useless, operating with a confusion typically reserved for medieval nobility encountering their first solar eclipse during a tax audit. A global call center apparatus acts as an openly hostile regime, wielding infinite queue times and weaponized apathy to crush the spirit of weary travelers into total psychological submission, though to its credit, the hold music features a very agreeable flute solo. I would not count on any assistance over the phone if you ever face a delayed flight. The Istanbul airport provides a wildly vast experience, operating as a highly modern crossroads where all of humanity inevitably intersects. We spent 4 hours killing time in a Turkish lounge before finally boarding our connection to Greece. Optimists frequently claim that when one door closes, a window opens, which is a catastrophic sequence of events for a pressurized passenger aircraft. As we prepared for takeoff, the physical journey finally shifted away from our localized plumbing disruptions. Somewhere just outside the terminal boundaries lay the historic geography of Constantinople, a landscape still defined by the ancient Theodosian walls and the final days of the last Greek-speaking Roman stronghold, Byzantium at the end of the wall. On our connection from Istanbul to Athens, we were surprisingly seated on another 787, settling in to ponder the cultural shift ahead. We are Americans, a demographic convinced that a dropped internet connection constitutes a profound crisis. Heading toward the territory of the Greeks, a people who stereotypically treat a 400-year Ottoman occupation as just a really long, annoying weekend. Our aircraft was actively vibrating down the runway when my pocket buzzed with a direct dispatch from the domestic front. It was the official update from our rapidly failing dwelling, a house that had chosen to spring a hidden hot water leak beneath the concrete slab. The text message confirmed that the second plumbing repair attempt, the one pitched to my in-laws as the definitive fix after the slab had already been cut open, had utterly failed as well, requiring the family to figure out an entirely alternative solution. Whatever confidence had been placed in that final surgical strike against the subterranean leak, the plumbing had rejected it entirely, and more invasive work was now unavoidable. This is exactly the sort of high-value intel you want right before hurtling into the sky toward a foreign nation, abandoning your in-laws to supervise a catastrophic indoor flood. The looming aquatic destruction of my own home mirrored one of the darkest days in the exact region outside the airplane window. There is a deep historical irony in beginning a pilgrimage to the Greek homeland by sitting safely inside Turkey. Down below sat the imposing, scarred limestone and brick of the Theodosian walls. These were the boundaries of the final stronghold of a deeply Greek Christian empire that once commanded absolute authority over the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantines proudly called their capital New Rome and considered themselves the unbroken continuation of the ancient Roman Empire, but their world was permanently anchored in the Greek East. When Emperor Constantine dedicated the city in 330 AD, he forged a capital that fused standard Roman statecraft with the Greek language and Christian worship. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed and abandoned all societal momentum during the Dark Ages, this Eastern Greek-speaking society reinvented itself. They aggressively hoarded the old intellectual heritage of antiquity. Royal monasteries and court schools furiously copied the works of Plato and other classical philosophers, treating secular Hellenic learning as a highly respected component of their Christian identity. Their sacred liturgy and religious chants were filtered entirely through the Greek language, embedding ancient linguistics into their methods of cultural survival. How did this center of Greek learning and wealth find itself surrounded and fighting for its life in the spring of 1453? The fatal damage was actually inflicted centuries earlier by their supposed friends. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, a Western Christian army found themselves deeply in debt to Venetian shipbuilders. Instead of marching on Jerusalem, they took a massive financial detour and sacked Constantinople, acting as heavily armored debt collectors. The Crusaders looted the incredible wealth of the city, burned the great libraries, and shattered the ruling structure to install a Latin Catholic regime straight into the grand Greek cathedral of Hagia Sophia. The Greek Byzantines eventually reclaimed their capital in 1261, but the empire never restored its former prestige or military muscle. That betrayal left wounds that would never fully heal, poisoning any prospect of genuine Western solidarity for the centuries that followed. By the 15th century, the Byzantine state had shrunk to embarrassingly small proportions. Through decades of aggressive expansion, the rising Ottoman Empire swallowed up the Balkans and key Greek cities like Thessaloniki, slowly tightening a solid ring around the capital. By the time the ambitious 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II ascended the throne in 1451, the once mighty empire consisted of little more than the immediate city limits of Constantinople and a few scraps of adjacent real estate. Inside the ancient walls, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos prepared his people to face the inevitable. What must the desperate emperor have thought as he looked over his crumbling defenses, knowing his allies in the west had abandoned him? He commanded a thin garrison of only about 7,000 men, an uninspiring mix of local Greeks and a handful of Italian mercenaries on contract. Waiting just outside was Mehmed II and a highly structured army of up to 80,000 troops, preparing to deploy terrifying new artillery explicitly engineered to smash ancient stone. The deep bitterness left over from the 1204 betrayal meant the Orthodox clergy refused to trust Western sincerity, and Europe completely failed to assemble a united rescue fleet. Constantinople was left totally isolated against an enemy heavily invested in the destructive potential of gunpowder. As the thrust of the aircraft engines forcefully pushed us into the sky, I gazed down at the remaining stretches of the old defensive walls slicing straight through the modern urban sprawl. Down there, an emperor had prepared to defend a 1,000-year-old legacy against an impending onslaught of experimental siege technology that would render those ancient fortifications completely obsolete. I pressed my forehead against the cool acrylic window, watching the physical sight of this inevitable structural collapse quietly fade into the afternoon clouds. completely consumed by the sudden realization that I had forgotten to move expensive items to a higher, more remote shelf before potential disaster. Orban's Basilica broke Constantinople's last walls. 16 centuries of divine favor had supposedly consecrated the great capital, yet the heavens offered no practical remedy when the rules of medieval warfare faced an abrupt revision. For over 800 years, the multi-tiered limestone fortifications of the Theodosian walls had successfully repelled every single siege thrown at them. The tragic garrison waiting behind these scarred stones assumed their ancient architecture would hold forever. But destiny, often disguised as a freelance metallurgist with a wagon full of blueprints, was about to arrive. In early 1452, a brilliant cannon founder named Orban journeyed into Constantinople. A man of likely Hungarian or Transylvanian origin, he approached the Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, with an unbelievable proposal. Orban offered to cast massive, large-caliber bombards that he promised would be capable of shattering even the most impregnable city walls. The meeting between the desperate sovereign and the visionary inventor should have been a glorious convergence of royal destiny and technological salvation. It could have been a transcendent alliance to rescue the ancient world from encroaching darkness. Instead, it was a painfully brief administrative rejection. The imperial treasury was entirely bankrupt. The city lacked the necessary stockpiles of bronze, iron, and timber, along with the specialized labor crews required to cast such monstrous guns. Mercenaries are frequently condemned for prioritizing cold profit over ideological fidelity, readily abandoning their employers the moment a superior contract materializes. Rebuffed by an empty wallet and a broken supply chain, Orban did not linger out of any religious or cultural loyalty to the Greeks. He simply packed up his blueprints. He crossed the enemy lines. He pitched his apocalyptic weapons directly to the Ottoman Sultan. Orban boldly boasted to Mehmed II that his new cannons could smash the walls of Babylon itself. This admirable dedication to upward professional mobility was fully shared by the Ottoman military administration. Possessing both an open wallet and a deep, burning hunger to conquer the city, the regime eagerly financed the project. They provided Orban with abundant raw materials and quickly set up a massive working foundry in Edirne. Under this lucrative new patronage, Orban cast a series of heavy artillery pieces. The crown jewel of this terrifying new arsenal was a colossal bombard known as the Basilica. This mechanical behemoth reportedly weighed many tons, required dozens of oxen just to drag it into position, and was designed to fire massive stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms directly at the aging masonry of the capital. Constantinople under Basilica fire. The royal checkbook had fully cleared, and the foreign master craftsman had delivered his apocalyptic hardware precisely to the city limits. In early April 1453, the tense waiting fractured into total chaos as the 55-day siege formally commenced. Mehmed II brought his massive army to encircle the capital, accompanied by the booming roar of Orban's monstrous new creations echoing across the Bosporus. While the ancient defences were brutally and repeatedly battered, the desperate Byzantines kept looking out toward the sea, essentially doom scrolling the horizon in hopes of spotting a massive Western rescue fleet. That horizon remained heartbreakingly empty. The Christian West entirely failed to unite to save them, as European leaders were fully paralyzed by their own mutual distrust and competing priorities. Over in Italy, the Venetian Senate actually held a prolonged, highly bureaucratic debate over sending an intervention force. Ultimately, they narrowly voted to maintain their rigid neutrality to protect their lucrative trade deals and safe shipping convoys with the Ottomans. A remarkably sound fiscal strategy for preserving capital in a volatile geopolitical market, even if it meant abandoning a fellow Christian state to total annihilation. Furthermore, any hope of international cooperation had been thoroughly poisoned by the bitter memory of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. During that catastrophic misunderstanding, Western armies had sacked Constantinople, stripped its majestic churches of valid physical assets, and installed a foreign Latin regime. This historic betrayal left deep, unhealed scars. Orthodox clergy highly doubted Western sincerity, and Western princes hesitated to spend blood and treasure bailing out an empire that consistently rejected the authority of the Pope. By the time any token contingents even plausibly thought of assembling, Constantinople was utterly ghosted, left entirely alone. Inside the city limits, the desperate defenders settled into a grueling, terrifying rhythm of destruction. While Orban's giant Basilica cannon operated as an elite psychological nightmare, the reality of utilizing it on the battlefield was incredibly messy and slow. Due to the massive recoil, the extreme heat, and severe metallic wear on the bronze barrel, this superweapon was surprisingly finicky. It was only capable of firing fewer than 10 shots a day, requiring extensive, careful maintenance between each ear-splitting blast. The true sustained damage to the city did not stem from the giant gun alone. Instead, the highly practical day-to-day work of chipping away at the ancient defenses was securely handled by a relentless battery of smaller, faster-firing Ottoman guns cast by local engineering talent. These smaller weapons methodically pounded the limestone and brick day and night, establishing a punishing cycle where exhausted citizens frantically patched breaches under the cover of darkness. The Orthodox Christians and their Western allies, meanwhile, spent weeks marshalling thoughts and prayers through endless theological committee meetings. Constantinople beneath Mehmed's eclipse. Yet it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set. J.R.R. Tolkien. Tracing the physical remnants of those desperate nighttime repairs grounds the sheer scale of the Byzantine struggle in cold reality. As the weary patriarch of a family unit undertaking a monumental transit across continents, I had been forced to survive the catastrophic collapse of a residential plumbing subsystem and traverse the hostile, congested checkpoints of Atlanta Transit just to examine this ancient dust. That specific personal crucible naturally attuned my sympathies to the battered defenders of Constantinople. They were somehow managing to hold the line against massive, overwhelming forces, operating purely on the quiet delusion that if they simply dragged the conflict out, the Ottoman army might lose its nerve. The primary record of this frantic architectural triage comes to us from the diary of Venetian eyewitness Niccolo Barbaro, who operated with the intense, highly neurotic energy of a man completely divorced from a normal social existence. Barbaro was exactly the sort of individual who meticulously color-coded his structural defect reports, catalogued minor masonry failures into lengthy daily briefs, and routed aggressively polite follow-up scrolls to his superiors, until an exasperated Venetian Republic shuffled him off to the most inconvenient field assignment ever conceived. Thanks to his obsessive documentation, we know exactly how the bleeding breaches were handled, hour by hour, as the defenders fumbled in the cold darkness to reset shattered limestone before sunrise. Sultan Mehmed II approached the conflict as a meticulous mastermind, blending academic theory with ruthless fieldwork. According to the chronicler Ducas, Mehmed treated the battlefield as a laboratory. He reportedly sketched the city walls every single night to pinpoint their weakest structural points, and essentially min-max his entire siege strategy. He refused to rely solely on the brute force of his giant bombards. Instead, he organized a highly calibrated attack that integrated traditional trebuchets and modern artillery with underground sappers and specialized assault units. It was a relentless protocol designed to exploit every possible vulnerability and keep the pressure constantly pushed to the absolute maximum. As the Ottoman lines closed in, the atmosphere inside the trapped city shifted from frantic to totally apocalyptic, and the defenders began to suspect the solar system itself was actively posting losses against them. On May 22, 1453, a partial lunar eclipse abruptly darkened the sky. For a terrified community buckling under the psychological terror of continuous bombardment, this was certainly not viewed as an interesting meteorological anomaly. They interpreted the celestial shadow as a disastrous, heart-stopping omen. The dread peaked a few evenings later. Right before the final assault was set to commence, an unusually dense fog rolled through the city streets and swallowed the capital in a cold, eerie gloom. To the exhausted citizens, this bizarre weather read as the ultimate sign of doom. Chroniclers recorded the event as the divine presence physically packing up and leaving Constantinople to its tragic fate, ensuring the ancient walls would not hold much longer. When Constantinople fell, oceans opened. A heavy atmospheric gloom hung over the final, seemingly supernatural nights of the siege, underscoring the sheer scale of the historical dread. For 55 grueling days, the exhausted defenders of Constantinople had patched crumbling stone defenses while enduring a terrifying, continuous rhythm of cannon fire. But the divine presence had already signaled its meteorological retreat. And finally, on May 29, 1453, the overwhelming Ottoman forces breached the ancient fortifications. The desperate Roman defenders simply collapsed under the weight of a highly choreographed assault, facing the ultimate hard reset of their civilization. Sultan Mehmed II rode into the conquered capital to execute a remarkably efficient administrative overhaul. His victory brought the Byzantine Empire to a violent end, violently shoving the timeline from the Middle Ages into the early modern period. To cement his new order, Mehmed immediately made his way to the Hagia Sophia. After operating as the beating heart of Eastern Christian worship for 9 centuries, the spectacular cathedral was converted into a mosque. This was not some minor adjustment to municipal zoning, functioning instead as the physical manifestation of the city's transformed fate. The Queen of Cities was now the center of the ascendant Ottoman world, and the previous Roman administration was permanently evicted from the premises. The final consequences of this collapse stretched far beyond the shattered city limits. The fall of Constantinople struck absolute panic into the collective psyche of Christian Europe. Suddenly, the formidable Eastern firewall was gone, and the Ottoman Empire had tightened its iron grip on the Bosporus. By dominating this vital maritime choke point, the Ottomans controlled the lucrative trade routes flowing between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The empire expanded its customs into a strict state monopoly, ensuring that Western merchants faced skyrocketing costs and highly unpredictable access to Eastern goods. This catastrophic supply chain disruption functioned exactly like a sudden, impenetrable toll gate dropped squarely across the Silk Road. This devastating economic pinch forced a panicked Europe to look outward, desperate to bypass the Ottoman monopoly and secure premium commodities without the exorbitant shipping fees. Maritime powers like Portugal and Spain were driven to finance daring, alternate sea routes to Asia. Ultimately, this massively underfunded nautical search launched the age of exploration. The tragic end of one epic medieval story in the eastern Mediterranean became the direct catalyst for Spanish ships blindly pushing toward the Gulf of Mexico, carrying scattered survivors of a fractured Greek world along with them. The geographic awakening of the mariners who charted those terrifying new oceans was purchased entirely by the blood of a fallen Roman capital. Don Teodoro, tar and vanishing tides. Catastrophic loss of a homeland to an invading empire does not typically look like an excellent career move. Yet for a Greek sailor named Don Teodoro, being violently ousted by the expanding Ottoman world proved to be the ultimate maritime resume builder. Fleeing the 1522 Ottoman conquest of Rhodes, he likely brought heavily guarded Mediterranean shipbuilding secrets to the Spanish Empire, just as it was desperately charting new routes across the Atlantic. This technical leverage earned him the honorific title of Don, a distinction usually reserved for Spanish nobility, high-ranking church officials, or anyone who could convincingly pretend they knew how to keep a wooden boat from sinking, and secured his position as a master artisan on the doomed 1528 Pánfilo de Narváez expedition to La Florida. Today he is celebrated as the first clearly documented Greek to set foot in what is now the United States. He almost certainly would have traded that posthumous honor for a single glass of clean water. By late summer, the Narváez expedition had devolved into a masterclass in logistical collapse. The land forces found themselves hopelessly stranded near Apalachee Bay with 0 ships, dwindling supplies, and entirely hostile terrain. The men made a desperate choice to build 5 crude barges to escape westward along the Gulf Coast. They possessed little more than panic, which is exactly when Teodoro stepped forward to save the effort. Drawing on his specialized Mediterranean knowledge, he taught the starving soldiers how to tap local pine trees for resin, which he then distilled into pitch to caulk the seams of their makeshift horsehide rafts. Without this chemical skill, the crude vessels would have sunk immediately. By keeping his commander from a watery grave, Teodoro technically pioneered the North American naval stores industry, successfully keeping the wretched flotilla afloat into the autumn. In late October 1528, the frail fleet was drifting along the central Gulf Coast, passing what are now the pristine, heavily marketed beaches of Florida's Highway 30A and Destin, and dying of thirst. They encountered Native American men in a canoe who agreed to fetch water if given containers. Faced with this transaction, Teodoro made a monumentally stubborn decision. He insisted on going ashore with the Native Americans to secure the water himself, boldly ignoring Governor Narváez's warnings and repeated attempts to dissuade him. He took an unnamed, enslaved black companion with him, while the Native Americans left 2 of their own on the barges as hostages. That night, the locals returned to the beach and handed back the containers, completely empty. They did not return Teodoro or his companion. The hostages on the barges wisely escaped. Dehydrated and out of leverage, the Spaniards simply sailed off in the dark, leaving the 2 men behind on the continent. 12 years later, Hernando de Soto marched his heavily armed forces through the interior of the southeast. In October 1540, at an inland native town in Alabama called Piachi, local indigenous leaders presented de Soto's men with a rusty Spanish dagger. They claimed the weapon had belonged to a Christian named Don Teodoro. The exact fate of the Greek shipwright remains a historical mystery shaped by varying translations of de Soto's chroniclers. Luis Hernández de Biedma reported that locals said Teodoro and the black man had stopped or were still among the Indians. This implies the chiefdoms may have kept the 2 men alive, correctly assessing that technical skills like making pitch or repairing tools were highly valuable, a highly functional immigration and retention policy that the Spanish completely failed to appreciate. Conversely, the account of Rodrigo Rangel states that the locals simply admitted they had killed them. Because the dagger surfaced over 100 miles inland from the coast, it indicates that either Teodoro was taken deep into the interior Mississippian trade networks as a captive, or he died near the water and his weapon was traded inland as a prestigious relic. Gripping the corroded iron artifact, de Soto surveyed the vast wilderness ahead. It is a surreal juxtaposition to imagine the bloody, desperate struggles of these early explorers playing out against the exact same backdrop of emerald waters and white sand beaches where modern tourists now sip overly sweet margaritas. I explore this bizarre collision of eras at length in my book, Conquistadors and Condos, The Hidden History of Florida's 30A. But the shadows of that fractured Mediterranean world stretched far beyond the Florida coastline. As Spanish and English ships pushed deeper into the arid limestone archipelago to the southeast, the botanical landscape itself seemed to mock their geopolitical traumas. A peculiar, stout plant was waiting in the dry earth, preparing to rename an entire string of islands after the very empire the Spanish were trying to escape: Turks and Caicos, Fezes and Thorns. Though early colonial mariners scoured the Caribbean for fresh water, the arid coastal geography remained a deceptive adversary. It hid jagged reefs and baked beneath a relentless sun, leaving these supposedly hardened explorers so desperate they began to hallucinate familiar haberdashery in the scrub. Squinting through spyglasses at the low-lying cays, homesick Spanish and English sailors spotted barrel-shaped plants scattered across the rocks. To men desperate for civilization, or at least a drink of water that wouldn't kill them, the fuzzy, reddish-brown cap growing on top of each cactus looked remarkably like a Turkish fez, the brimless felt hat commonly worn by the very Ottoman forces they had spent decades either fighting or fleeing in the Mediterranean. The resemblance was apparently so striking that they began calling the archipelago the Turks' Islands. When combined with Cayahico, the Lucayan Taino phrase for a string of islands, the modern name of the territory was born. It is a rare botanical achievement for a plant to christen a jurisdiction simply by wearing a hat. Inspecting the preserved tracts of ambergris cay, examining every inch of scrubby coastal coppice, and feeling the jagged edges of the dry oolitic limestone, reveals nothing but stout, ribbed, globe-like green bodies sitting in a surreal still life. These are the Turks' head cacti, known botanically as Melocactus intortus. The life story of this curious cactus is an exercise in slow, highly defensive adaptation to a hostile environment. As a juvenile plant, the green body grows steadily, stockpiling precious water inside its ribbed torso like a besieged fortress hoarding grain. Once it reaches maturity, the green base stops growing entirely. Instead, the plant devotes all its metabolic energy to producing a specialized woolly structure called a cephalium. Composed of dense, red bristles and soft fluff, this biological fez acts as a protective shield, defending the plant's delicate flowers from the blistering tropical sun. The red cap simply continues to stretch taller year after year, while the green base remains frozen in size, resulting in the appearance of a very prickly, immobile man who absolutely refuses to take off his winter hat in July. Yet it is only from this woolly cap that reproduction actually happens. Tiny magenta flowers emerge from the dense bristles, eventually giving way to waxy, bright, pinkish-red fruits. Locals affectionately refer to these sweet, slightly tangy treats as cactus cherries, and they operate as a strictly functional currency in the island ecosystem. By providing this sweet sustenance, the cactus secures its own future, relying on the local wildlife to engage in a necessary biological transaction. Today, the Turk's head cactus is a protected species, persisting quietly alongside luxury developments and shifting economies. I once watched a native curly-tailed lizard pause on a lower rib of a nearby cactus, its throat pulsing in the heat, before scrambling upward to tear a single pink cherry from the dense red bristles. It swallowed the fruit whole and retreated into the fractured shade of the coppice, carrying the tiny black seeds away across the limestone. The red-capped figure remained behind in the glaring sun, rooted securely in porous rock that holds no water, silently offering its remaining harvest to an empty shoreline, a static exchange I noted in my book Conch and Consequence, hopping across Turks and Caicos from Grace Bay to Ambergris Cay, before turning my back on the field and walking toward the sound of the tide. But the Ottoman spectre that those early sailors projected onto Caribbean flora was merely a phantom of the empire's actual grip on the eastern Mediterranean. While 16th-century explorers were busy mapping their geopolitical anxieties onto a cactus, the Greek populations who remained behind were learning to endure genuine Ottoman administration. Their survival in the centuries following the fall of Constantinople required adaptations far more complex than trading pink fruit to a lizard. Leaving these colonial Caribbean digressions behind and finally bringing my own itinerary back to its intended destination, I realized that the historical necessity of bargaining with strict, opaque authority had simply evolved into modern forms. It was a reality that became immediately apparent the moment I landed in Athens and encountered the airport's passport control. Athens after Ottomans, passports and patriarchs. Stepping off the plane, buoyed by nothing more than the modest superiority of our forward cabin seating, we marched toward the desks, expecting a reasonably orderly welcome. Instead, we ran straight into an administrative labyrinth worthy of the Byzantine bureaucracy itself. An environment composed entirely of procedure, with no obvious path through it. Retractable nylon barriers forced every arriving passenger to walk the full length of an empty hallway and back just to join the rear of the line. Faced with this pointless maze, I thought of the Gordian knot and decided against untangling it. I simply unhooked the strap, stepped through the gap, and hooked it neatly back into place behind me, reassembling the barrier so the machinery of the state could keep functioning exactly as designed, and mildly inconveniencing everyone still waiting behind me. The man in front of me burst out laughing, and we bonded briefly over the architectural comedy of the whole terminal. Finding a quiet workaround for senseless bureaucracy is practically a regional inheritance. When the shockwaves from Constantinople's fall settled in the late 15th century, the Ottomans took control of Athens and the broader Greek territories. Most outside observers assumed the old Orthodox identity would simply be erased, but the surviving Greeks spent the next 4 centuries navigating a far more severe version of opaque authority. They turned their rugged geography into a physical fortress, while quietly building administrative loopholes to protect their culture. The keepers of this memory were largely monks. In isolated enclaves like Mount Athos, Orthodox orders found a durable loophole, negotiating privileges, tax exemptions, and the right to manage their own estates through imperial decrees known as berats and firmans. These arrangements let monastic libraries function as secure vaults for an entire civilization's history. Behind thick stone walls, clerics preserved vast collections of Byzantine manuscripts, and in secret academies known as Krifoskolio, teachers worked quietly to keep the Greek language and Christian faith alive. Much of that endurance ran through the rum millet system, an Ottoman administrative structure that placed all Orthodox Christians under the authority of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. Because the Patriarchate oversaw local courts, property rights, and education, the language and liturgy stayed largely intact. Christians were officially subordinate under Islamic law, facing actual restrictions on worship, yet Greek-speaking clerics, poets, and chroniclers kept meeting under quiet patronage to produce work that reinforced a sense of lineage. Survival in the wider world meant striking deals. Greece was never a single unified territory under Ottoman rule. It operated instead as a patchwork of provinces run by regional administrators who frequently bargained with Greek elites. Across the islands and mountain ranges, communities built hybrid systems of self-governance. Islanders traded basic cooperation for autonomy, using local councils called koinitites to manage their own affairs and keep direct imperial interference at bay. Sometimes that freedom was bought outright. The villages of Chios harvested mastic gum, a prized luxury good, and used that economic leverage to secure tax breaks and long-term protection. In harsher mountain regions, the Ottomans hired local Greek militias called armatoloi to police the roads and keep order. Many of these men were former bandits, or klefts, who enforced imperial law in exchange for wages and local power, and whose loyalties conveniently shifted the moment the political winds did. Through this localized mix of taxation, armed leverage, and careful negotiation, Greek identity survived long enough to fuel the independence movement that followed. After bypassing the airport stanchions and finally clearing the passport desk, we took a taxi to the confusingly named New Hotel, found a bed, and went straight to sleep. Navigating the modern capital would have to wait until morning. To understand how that fiercely independent, highly localized concept of Greek identity first emerged, we would have to look far past the Ottoman centuries, traveling back to the recovery that followed the Bronze Age collapse, when isolated communities first began experimenting with the idea of the self-governing city. Delphi, Polis, and Greece reborn, or at least I attempted to. No sunlight breached the blackout curtains of the New Hotel, but I found little of the restorative slumber I desperately needed. My physical form rested on an exceptionally supportive premium mattress, but my mind was already booting up the required historical context for the day. Outside our window, modern Athens hummed. Inside, the air conditioning unit had failed, and the temperature had somehow climbed to 25 degrees Celsius. Around 800 BCE, humanity entered the Archaic period, a spectacular era of social restructuring. The landscape at that time was not a unified empire managed by a single despotic overseer. Instead, a radical civic hardware update was installed across the rugged mountains and sun-drenched coastal valleys. This was the polis, or city-state. It was not merely a physical dot on a map or a collection of stone buildings where people hid from the weather. The polis formed the architectural embodiment of political identity, demanding that everyday citizens actively participate in the governance of their reality. How did a fractured network of isolated, sun-scorched settlements manage to formulate the earliest concepts of democratic citizenship instead of simply defaulting to eternal local warfare? The answer lies in their brilliant, chaotic divergence. Navigating the dusty, unpaved routes connecting these newly minted municipalities revealed wildly divergent political ecosystems. Down in the southern Peloponnese lay Sparta, a society that min-maxed its cultural attributes entirely for civic order and military discipline. They followed the operational parameters established by the semi-legendary lawgiver Lycurgus and a rigid set of ritual political commands known as the Great Retra. Sparta utilized a highly paranoid balance of power to govern itself. The city operated a dual king system paired with a Gerousia, a council of elders, and overseen by an executive board of 5 elected ephors who wielded enough authority to place even the kings on trial. To maintain this system, young Spartan boys were funneled into the agoge, a brutally intensive state-run training program designed to forge them into the ultimate hoplite warriors. A journey north into Attica revealed a completely different social experiment compiling concurrently in Athens. Here, the early stages of democracy were slowly taking shape through dynamic iterations and messy public debates. The city began shifting power away from elite aristocratic councils, such as the one that traditionally held its closed-door meetings on the bare rock of the Areopagus Hill, forcing a deliberate move toward broader civic participation. Despite these aggressively opposing political builds, the Greeks of the Archaic period were relentlessly mobile. They sailed the Mediterranean to establish new colonies along distant foreign coasts, engaging in a massive expansion of their cultural domains. Recognizing their shared traits, despite being fractured into hundreds of fiercely independent and rival factions, these widespread communities forged a deeply shared Hellenic identity. This open-source culture manifested physically at the great pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. At the sacred oracle of Delphi, leaders from rival cities waited in essentially the same queue to receive cryptic advisory updates from the identical female prophet, the Pythia. At the sanctuary of Olympia, elite athletes from across the Mediterranean gathered to honor Zeus, speaking the exact same language and battling for highly symbolic crowns of wild olive leaves. By the time this era reached its violent collision with the expanding Persian Empire in the early 5th century BCE, the Archaic period had successfully laid the durable frameworks of law, art, and community that would launch Greece into its legendary classical age. I sat up from the premium hotel linens, sweating slightly in the broken climate control, recognizing the sheer administrative weight of establishing Western political thought from scratch. Before breakfast. Marathon where Athens outran empire. I finally abandoned the premium mattress, preparing to leave our unventilated quarters and step into the sun-drenched reality of Attica. The stifling room felt like a targeted curse from the gods, leaving my body weary alongside the lingering fatigue of navigating airport security, yet my mind remained fixed on the timeline of human governance. The Archaic period had installed the civic operating system of the Polis, but that newly built Athenian democracy was about to face a brutal stress test on the plain of Marathon. In 490 BCE, looking out toward the Aegean, the terms of the world shifted entirely. A massive Persian army landed on this stretch of beach because King Darius I had taken the Ionian revolt personally. Athens had backed that revolt, going so far as to help burn the Persian city of Sardis. Herodotus recorded that Darius was so enraged by the insult that he shot an arrow into the sky as an appeal to Zeus for revenge. He then assigned a servant a strange daily duty. Every time dinner was served, the man had to remind him 3 times, "Master, remember the Athenians." It was an obsessive, almost religious campaign of vengeance that turned a standard military expedition into a highly personal grudge match. Dragging my heavily caffeinated self across foreign pavement, I had to admit I understood Darius on some functional level. I am driven by a similarly petty desire to outlast my own domestic disasters through sheer geographic distance, refusing to let a persistent hot water leak under my floorboards dictate my personal narrative. Where Darius mobilized an empire for retribution, I mobilized my family across the Atlantic, largely to avoid dealing with my homeowner's insurance. When the Persians arrived at Marathon, the Athenians were badly outnumbered. They received backup from a small determined contingent from Plataea, but were otherwise on their own. General Miltiades, leading the Greek defense, recognized that a straightforward clash of hoplite lines would be a disaster for Athens. Instead, he set a trap. He deliberately thinned the center of his phalanx while reinforcing the 2 wings. The battle began, and the Persians drove straight through the weakened Greek center, assuming they had broken the line. Rather than fleeing, the reinforced Greek wings folded inward, catching the invaders in a brutal pincer. The heavy hoplite infantry excelled at close-quarters fighting, crushing the larger Persian force in a single day and keeping them from establishing a foothold near the capital. The victory proved that Athenian democracy could survive on its own military strength, without appealing to Sparta for protection. Marathon also gave rise to the foundational myth of endurance sports. The legend holds that a messenger ran roughly 40 kilometers from the battlefield to Athens, announced the victory, and dropped dead on the spot. Writers like Plutarch likely added that fatal flourish later. Herodotus, instead, documented a real courier who ran an astonishing 240 kilometers to Sparta to beg for reinforcements before the fighting even started. The myth of the dead messenger eclipsed the living one, and the anonymous runner, by collapsing and dying in the dirt, somehow secured himself a permanent place as the founding hero of distance running. That singular victory bought the Greeks a fragile window of time to prepare. An uneasy peace that would hold only until a new Persian king marched his vast forces toward a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae. Thermopylae where legends narrow and history widens. Weighing the wrath of a father who threw a legendary tantrum and lost an entire army on the plains of Marathon, Xerxes I chose to escalate the family grudge tenfold. In 480 BCE, the new King of Kings drove a massive invasion force down the northern coastline. Ancient writers claimed his army numbered in the millions, while modern historians estimate a still staggering 120,000 to 300,000 men. Xerxes was driven by imperial ambition, a hunger for prestige, and a personal thirst for revenge over the Greeks' earlier defiance. Thermopylae, known to the ancient world as the Hot Gates, offered a defensive nightmare in a rugged tectonic landscape. Confronting my own unsolvable home infrastructure disasters gave me an absurd, completely unearned sense of solidarity with the logistical bottleneck waiting in this narrow coastal choke point. King Leonidas I of Sparta commanded that bottleneck. Raised in the brutal Spartan military training system known as the agoge, Leonidas led a coalition of roughly 7,000 Greek soldiers. He knew the numbers were hopeless, representing the kind of mismatch that would make any rational commander turn back. Instead, he used the terrain. By positioning his men between the steep mountains and the sea, Leonidas found a geographical loophole. He funneled the Persians into a space so narrow their overwhelming numbers counted for little. For days, the Greek hoplites held the line against wave after wave of Persian attacks. The mood in the camp was famously captured in a single quip. When warned that Persian arrows would be so numerous they'd blot out the sun, a Spartan named Dienekes is said to have replied, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." Later tradition also credits Leonidas with the phrase molon lab, meaning "come and take them," when asked to surrender his weapons. The Spartans had a gift for self-mythology long before the historians arrived to help. That gift has since been passed down through the centuries, to the rear windshield of every F-150 in Tennessee. Despite their defense, the Greeks were undone by a local man named Ephialtes. He revealed a secret mountain route called the Anopeia Trail to the Persians. This betrayal let enemy forces climb over the mountains under cover of night and encircle the Greek position entirely. Realizing the pass was lost, Leonidas made a fateful decision. To preserve the bulk of the Greek army for future battles, he ordered most of the Allied forces to retreat. He then formed a rearguard to hold the line and buy time. Popular memory insists this rearguard was made up entirely of 300 Spartans. The historical record is richer than that. Standing alongside the 300 Spartans were 400 Thebans and 700 Thespians, who chose to stay and die with Leonidas rather than flee. These remaining troops fought from the front and the rear until they were completely overwhelmed. Thermopylae fell, and Xerxes marched south to eventually capture and burn Athens. The stand at the Hot Gates had bought precious time, trading lives for a tactical delay that inflicted heavy damage on enemy morale and allowed the Greek navy to hold at nearby Artemisium. A modern stone marker preserves the memory of those who fell, engraved with the ancient epitaph attributed to Simonides. "Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. With the pass broken and the Persians advancing on an evacuated capital, the fractious Greek city-states faced the very real prospect of total collapse, forcing them to look toward the sea and a desperate defense in the narrow straits of Salamis. Salamis, where Xerxes lost the plot. The brilliant Athenian leader Themistocles possessed a truly staggering amount of main character energy. When the Oracle of Delphi cryptically advised the Greeks to trust in their wooden walls, it was a classic ancient vague post. Finding a literal wooden wall to hide behind does not make you an impenetrable defensive genius, because it mostly just makes you an accidental campfire enthusiast. Themistocles shrewdly interpreted the prophecy as a divine directive to build and rely on a powerful navy of triremes. Knowing they could not possibly match the sheer numbers of the Persian armada in open water, the allied Greek commanders decided to use the cramped environment to their absolute advantage. They deliberately lured the opposing fleet into the tight channel separating the island of Salamis from the Athenian mainland. In these constrained waters, the overwhelming numerical and material superiority of the Persian forces counted for very little. It was the tactical equivalent of forcing a vast procession of gilded imperial chariots through a narrow mountain goat path. As the battle commenced, the environment itself seemed to join the Greek coalition. A strong seasonal Etesian sea breeze kicked up. This wind perfectly suited the smaller, highly maneuverable Greek ships, while it severely disrupted the larger, heavier Persian vessels in the deep but confined strait, sending their formation into chaotic disarray. Relying on their deep local knowledge, tight cohesion, and daring tactical maneuvers, the Greek sailors decisively crushed the Persian armada. I envisioned Xerxes watching his magnificent fleet shatter into splinters from a highly comfortable and suitably expensive golden throne on the hillside above the straits. Because his massive army required constant seaborne supply chains hugging the coast, the loss of sea control meant he could no longer sustain his full invasion force in Greece. He had to withdraw the bulk of his army back to Asia, leaving behind a smaller land force that the Greeks would ultimately defeat at the Battle of Plataea the following year. Xerxes and his Persian army represented a terrifying, insatiable engine of imperial conquest that stripped the landscape bare, crushed independent city-states beneath the sandals of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and threatened to extinguish the very concept of democratic governance in its infancy. On the other hand, their ability to deploy vast wealth to efficiently finance a transnational supply chain was genuinely spectacular to behold. Greece spent roughly 3,000 years building, losing, surviving, and rebuilding before anyone thought to write a travelogue about it, which puts one family's ferry tickets and HOA dispute into reasonable perspective. What holds across all of it, from the Polis to the Ottomans to the 1920s refugee resettlement, is that continuity here was never handed down intact but argued for, negotiated and carried quietly through monasteries and village lanes until the next opening arrived. Next time, the journey moves from the broad sweep of history into something more immediate. A rough crossing, a sleeping child, a jellyfish remembered from decades ago, and the question of whether a place can feel both entirely new and already yours. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Hades, or High Water. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community on Patreon.